Welcome. I'm Bill Hopkins, President of the Cross Timbers Chapter. Tonight we also have with us Catherine Stanley, our Vice President of Programs, and she'll be introducing our speaker for tonight, John Sackett.
Good evening, everyone. And this is Catherine Stanley, and this we have a presentation tonight from John Sackett. John Sackett is the Zone 5 soil scientist out of our at the Weatherford Zone Office for the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service. And he has graciously agreed to share some of his knowledge on soil health and the up and coming information and the latest details. So, John, I'd like to turn it over to you now. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Catherine. Just like to start off and say, happy to talk with the group today. I deal with soils, but I like to think of soils, in the whole context of the ecosystem of the environment, how it relates to plants, animals, all those type of things, and humans, especially in the Metroplex area. We can't ignore how we as humans interact with the ecosystem and the impact on it. So I'm going to talk about a few of those things, and I encourage everybody to ask questions. Type them into the chat there. I love questions, so we'll have plenty of time at the end for that. I'm going to turn my camera off, and then we'll go ahead and get started. So just some of the topics today, we're going to talk about, what is soil? Some of the soil basic and those properties. We're going to talk about soil health as a component of overall soil and how that relates to the ecosystem functions like water cycle, nutrient cycle, things like that. And then if we have time, we're going to get into some web soil survey. And then, like I said, we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. So I always like to start is, what is the difference between soil and dirt? Okay. And it's a question that I never really thought about until high school and got into land judging and some of those things. And my ag teacher said, John, the difference between soil and dirt is soil grows plants, grows crops, things like that. And dirt is what's under your fingernails. Okay, so dirt is soil that's out of place. And for me, dirt is kind of the four-letter word. Okay, so I try to call it soil, but, it's all good. A lot of people call it dirt, but soil is alive in a sense, just like we are. And so I'm going to hopefully be able to illustrate that in my presentation today. There's a lot of stuff going on in this world. Just a while ago, I had the TV on as we were finishing supper here, and, COVID news and Russia, Ukraine news and inflation and gas prices news. And I was like, I just can't handle any more of this just depressing stuff, So I flipped the channel and it had scuba divers on there. And I really learned something from that. I didn't realize it, but if any of y'all have scuba dived before, they always fall backwards out of the boat. And they were talking, they said, do you know what happens if they were to fall forward instead of backwards? And I'd be like, no. Well, the guy said, they'd still be in the boat. So I always got to throw a joke in there. So we talked about the difference between soil and dirt, and now we're going to talk about what makes soil so unique. And in Texas, we have a wide variety of soils. And the reason because we have such a wide variety is because we have a wide range in the soil forming factors, okay? And there's 5 of those. And just to list them off there, the first one is geology. The second one is topography. The third one is time. The fourth one is climate. And then the fifth one is biota, or all living things have an effect on the soil. So in north central Texas, where we're at, we have several different types of geology, right? There's a picture on the bottom left-hand side I took just south of Weatherford of some Comanche Peak limestone. Very little soil material there, really a tough environment, but you can see that ash juniper's doing a good job getting its roots down there in that limestone. On the right-hand side, I took that picture on the west side of Parker County, and the locals call that shale, and it's really more of a mudstone, but this happens to be Pennsylvanian age material, so it's about 300 million years old. when this was initially deposited. So it's really old stuff, not very weathered. And again, a lot of clay in it, and it's really a pretty tough environment for those plants. And then the middle picture there, if anybody's from Oklahoma, I think a little piece of Oklahoma in the presentation, that's the Red River. So the parent material for those soils, of course, is what we call alluvium or water carrying materials. Topography also has an impact on the soil development. And this is the top right-hand picture is one that I took on the Erath and Bosque County line. And you can see several different distinct plant communities. In the foreground, not very sloping, right? Good stand, a little blue stem right there. On the back, or the background of that picture on that hill, of course, is a lot more slope, right? Totally different plant community and really the same grazing management. There's no fence between that hill and that little blue stem right there. But if you picture a raindrop falling on that hill, is it going to go into the soil or run off? And really, it's going to run off, right? So it has a less infiltration. And so those soils are drouthier, which impacts the plant community, which kind of goes down to the biota aspect of the forming factors. All of these plants help contribute to those soil profiles. So they help those soils build. And in turn, those soils, help nourish those plants. And kind of the theme today is you can't separate the plants from the soils. They go together like peanut butter and jelly. So that's kind of the theme for today's presentation. And I'll go back to climate right quick. Texas, on the east side of the state, I grew up in Liberty County. We get average 60 inches of rainfall. I think when Hurricane Harvey hit that year, we had 120 inches of rain down there. Our soils in that part of the world down there, very leached. So all of that rainfall leaches calcium, magnesium, manganese, all of those things down deep into the soil profile. Compared to, say, out around El Paso, you're in that 8 to 10 inch rainfall. Those soils have a lot of calcium, a lot of magnesium, manganese, and things like that. So the climate has an impact on the soils. And because of that, we have just a wide variety of different looking soils. Those are just kind of some examples from different parts of the state. Right now I cover 52 counties in north central Texas, but I've worked pretty much the whole state from Beaumont to Van Horn, down worked in Zapata County on the border, all the way up to Lubbock. So in Texas, we have about 2,000 different types of soil. And like I said, they go together like peanut butter and jelly. These on the screen right now are two pictures. On the left-hand side is the Grand Prairie. I took that picture up around Denton. You can see it's pretty much a treeless prairie until you get down into the riparian area where we have elms, pecan, cottonwood, things like that. And on the right-hand side is a picture I took just south of Weatherford in Cross Timbers, what we call major land resource area. So totally different plant communities, and it's reflected in the soils. On the left-hand side, we have dark, what we call mollisols, high in organic matter. That soil will have 3 or 4% organic matter. And then the bottom of it, you can see calcium deposits, secondary calcium, carbonates. All of that soil profile looks like that because of the prairie plant community. Okay. On the right-hand side, a different story, right? We have a sandy surface on top of a clay pan, we call it, or red clay. And at the very bottom, we have some unconsolidated sandstone, or what we call parent material. Okay. Like I said, and this profile picture was taken not far from those trees. Those trees do well in that sandy surface and the red clay subsoil. In my opinion, I think because of the pH. So the pH on the soil on the right-hand side is acidic. Acidic soils tend to foster fungi, and that fungi helps form that symbiotic relationship with the oak trees. On the left-hand side, all of that calcium helps boost the pH of this soil. So on the right-hand side, that Grand Prairie soil has a pH of 7.5 to 8.2. Okay, so that more alkaline or basic pH tends to foster the grasses. Okay, so we're going to talk some more about soil properties, and they're really important because that sets the framework for the ecosystem function. And there are just a gajillion different soil properties, and we've grouped them into three classes: physical, chemical, and biological. So some examples of physical soil properties would be texture, which is the ratio of sand, silt, and clay. So I'm sure everybody's heard of like sandy soils or clayey soils or loam. Those would be examples of texture. Structure is how the soil particles are arranged. And you can see that middle picture there. That is some angular blocky soil structure that they call it. Color is a soil property. Getting into the chemical one, the best example of that is pH. And pH is basically the measurement of the concentration of hydrogen ions. So, and if it's an acidic pH, like I said, totally different plant community from the alkaline pH ones. And the third group is biological soil properties. And this one, I didn't study much in college. I graduated Tarleton in 03 and then 05 in the master's. We didn't really talk about soil biology as much, but over the last probably 5 to 10 years, we're really starting to understand the importance of the biology. So y'all might have heard some of the phrases like symbiotic fungi that grow in association with plant roots. That would be an example of soil biology. It ranges all the way from bacteria, the very smallest of the microbes, all the way to earthworms, which are some of the largest. An example of physical soil properties that really dictates the plant community also is available water holding capacity of the soil. And that relates in large part to the texture. So there are three soil particles: sand, which is the largest, silt, which is the medium size, and then clay size particles, which are the smallest. So 2 millimeters is the largest that a soil particle can be. Once the diameter of the particle gets larger than 2 millimeters, we consider it a rock fragment or gravel, okay? And that would kind of be the equivalent of a bowling ball size. If you get into clay size particles, I equate those to sort of like marbles. And so to demonstrate water holding capacity, if you had 2 trash cans, one full of bowling balls and then one full of marbles, and then you fill them each up with water, which one would hold more water? And the answer is the one with the marbles, because there's more surface area there. There's more room for the water. And so soils with more clay and more silt tend to hold more water for that very reason. And so they tend to be a little bit more productive than the real sandy soils. So what makes soils productive? Well, like I said, those native plant communities, and they were diverse. Our native plant communities would have 200, 300, or 400 different species in them. All of those plants fed the soil in a different way, okay, through root exudates and decomposing plant material. Our soils had a diverse diet and really contributed to the organic matter and then soil biology, okay? And then also those plants supported a diverse herd of above and below ground animals, right? We think of our grazers, historic grazers, buffalo, antelope, prairie dogs, things like that. We had just as much diversity, if not more, below the ground, because there are thousands and thousands of different species of just bacteria alone. And all of those forces, that balance of the plants and animals, fed the soil and made them what we see today that are so productive. But, kind of the sad part of the story is that equilibrium has changed, right? So that picture there on the left-hand side is, I would call it a typical cropland field, right? What is our plant diversity out there? It's pretty low. They might have one crop in rotation, or a diverse crop rotation nowadays is about 4 different species, right? It could be cotton, corn, wheat, and then maybe soybeans or something like that. anytime something else grows, any other kind of weed, they work pretty hard to kill it, right? So what we're seeing is the equilibrium is changing. So we went from a large triangle. Now our soil health is starting to diminish and be less productive. And so that's what we're seeing over time. We're losing organic matter, we're losing water holding capacity, and different things like that. So it's starting to alter those cycles. And on top of that, do you see any grazers out there? No. I mean, cow would starve out there. So we remove that whole part of the ecosystem. Now, it's not just cropland, right? I just Googled a picture of a neighborhood, and that's the picture I found on the right-hand side. How much plant diversity is in that picture? Now, you can't tell because it's a grainy picture, but there's not much plant diversity there at all. What about grazers? I don't see any cattle or chickens or anything like that. So even if it's not cropland, these neighborhoods are starting to impact our soils as well. So now just to kind of segue into soil health, we looked at rangeland and we kind of asked ourselves, why are these soils so productive? And this is a picture from the Blackland Prairie down just north of Temple. I was out there touring with a master naturalist group, and we counted about 100 different species of plants that day. And so when we asked ourselves, why is this area so productive? We said, well, the soil surface is covered, so there's no bare ground. It was managed for droughts, floods, and fires, which means it wasn't overgrazed, for example. There's, like I said, good plant diversity, good solar capture, right? There's plenty of little solar panels out there to collect that sunlight. Not only in the summer when I took this picture, but in the wintertime too with the cool season plants. And good grazing management that I would just kind of call good management of the biology. Compared to this picture I took in, I believe it was Haskell County. Bare soil, okay, so this is in poor condition, bare soil. It wasn't managed for droughts. So in other words, that guy ran the same number of cattle in his pasture regardless of whether it was a good growing season or bad growing season, okay? He would just put out a little more protein or put out hay to keep his cattle in somewhat decent condition, but really the plants were suffering here. Low plant diversity, there's maybe a half dozen plant species in this picture. Low solar capture, right? Because sunlight that hits that soil is going to reflect, so it won't be captured. And then, like I said, poor grazing management. So we looked at those two examples and we kind of came up with 5 principles that we can use to improve soil health. So the first principle is armor the soil surface with either living plants or plant residue. The second one is minimize disturbance. So in Texas, we're blessed with disturbances, right? So examples, like I said, droughts or floods, seems like it's always one or the other. Well, our management should reflect that. The third principle is increase plant diversity, and we're going to talk more about that. The fourth one is try to keep a living root year round. So have those warm season and cool season plants there to capture that solar energy. And then the fifth one is foster the soil biology. Do anything we can do to help those microbes. And we're going to talk more about each of those principles. But as a plant society, the exciting part, I would say for y'all, is plants are the key to all of those soil health principles. We had a researcher, Dr. Rick Haney, that worked at Temple. He's retired now, but his phrase was plants fix dirt, right? So dirt is really degraded soil. So he's saying plants are the key to changing dirt into soil. And so just some pictures there. The bottom one is a picture that our conservationists took in Baylor County outside of Seymour. And you can see the plant residue on the left-hand side of that picture. What happened is the farmer ran a hot wire kind of right where my cursor is right there. And on the right-hand side of that, he just plowed it up with a conventional disc drill plow. On the left-hand side, he let his cattle graze those residues. And of course, he got a rain, so you can hopefully see the water standing on the soil surface. On the left-hand side of that picture, the raindrops fell, but they were intercepted by the plant residue. So that residue dissipated the energy of those raindrops and let that water slowly infiltrate into the ground. On the right-hand side, that the rain, and everybody's been in a hard pelting rain, the energy of those raindrops, it really hurts, right, when it hits you in the head. So it would hit the soil and it would form a crust, okay? And it just nearly instantly seals off that soil to where that rainfall did not infiltrate into the soil, right? So I always ask, do you think that water actually made it into the soil profile? And I don't think it did, because what happens after a rain in Texas? Either the wind starts to blow or it gets hot, right? When that sun comes out and that water is lost to evaporation. So even if, like, say in Weatherford, we have about 35-inch rainfall belt that we're in, what is the actual effective precipitation? Okay, does 75% of that water make it into the soil, or 50% maybe? A lot less than we think. For sure, not 100%. In the top pictures there, the good old bluebonnet, and on the right-hand side is a picture I took of the root from a bluebonnet, and you can see that swollen root is the nodules that the bacteria has formed in association with that plant root, and the bacteria are fixing nitrogen, or is fixing, I'm not sure if it's is or are, fixing nitrogen to be available for that plant. So I'm sure y'all are all familiar with that, the importance of legumes. What we didn't understand is how, or I'll speak for myself, I was ignorant in this, of just how important soil biology was to plant nutrients. Okay, so there's some data now that's indicating that no nutrients get into that plant root without first passing through some kind of a soil microbe, either bacteria or fungi or something like that. So I can't overstate how important that soil biology is. And we know this for several reasons, but the main one is plants actively attract these microbes, okay, through what they call root exudates. So some of the data is indicating plants will send between 5 and 20% of their carbon that they make through photosynthesis. So, plants make their own food, right? And just in general terms, I call it photosynthate. That photosynthate, 5 to 20% of that, the plants send to their roots and exude that to feed the fungi, bacteria, and those different things. And if you're ever in, just for example, and I don't know if anybody is able to, but if you're ever around a corn plant and can dig it up when it's actively growing, if you dig up a corn plant and break off some of the very tips of those roots, they're very sweet. And that sweetness comes from that sugar or photosynthate, okay? So fungi, just to use them as an example, there's a species or group, or actually it's a genus of fungi called arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. And the fungi grow actually into the plant roots, okay? And there's a picture of it on the right-hand side there that I borrowed from Google. The fungi grows into the plant roots to get that carbon, and in exchange, the fungi gives the plant things like phosphorus and water, okay? So it's effectively increasing the surface area of those roots. Now, in the picture, it's the two different views of the same root, and that's a root hair, okay? Everybody knows how small a root hair is. I mean, they're very, very tiny. So you can see all the fungal strands, hyphae, they're called, coming out of that root. And so they're just very, very fractions of an inch in diameter. And the good news, they're small, so they can explore through the soil and get into places where plant roots can't go. and they can mine phosphorus, potassium, and different plant nutrients. So I can't overstate again how important fungi are for plants. And almost all of our native plants form association with the fungi. So like Catherine said, I work for the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and part of what we do is to install what we call conservation practices on the land, whether it's a farm or ranch. And so just some of the practices that we install to try to implement the soil health principles are no-till. Some people call it residue management, prescribed grazing. So we try not to overgraze any areas. To increase plant diversity between cash crops, we plant what we call cover crop, and they can range from one species up to 20 different species of plants to try to increase that plant diversity. We also do what we call range planting, where we plant native plants onto cropland or degraded rangeland, things like that, to try to increase plant diversity. And everything's about a catchphrase nowadays. So today's kind of catchphrase is climate smart agriculture. I've got my window open. I call it my library, but it's the spare bedroom, and naturally there's a plane going by. Hopefully it's not too loud. So when the soil is in a good, healthy state, right? So we've got the surface covered. We keep it kind of shaded with the residues so it's not too hot. We've minimized disturbance so we're not plowing it up too much. We have good plant diversity. We're starting to see our soil microbe population increase. One of the ways that we can tell that things are kind of blowing and going is by the population of the earthworms. Okay, so these are some pictures that I took at a soil pit down at Temple in the Blackland a few years ago, and look at the size of the earthworms that we were digging up out of that pit. That sucker there is about 8 inches long. Now, these aren't the native ones. These are introduced night crawlers, and so they can have a detriment to the ecosystem, but think of the good diversity of the native worm population as well. So at least in this part of the world, earthworms have not caused a problem because they're filling a void or filling an empty niche that was caused by our management. So look at the good sized channels or tunnels that those things are leaving in the soil. One of the hindrances of plant production is water, right? It's so easy to picture water moving down through the soil profile in those channels and bringing nutrients with it as well. Now, in this case, there were so many earthworms leaving casts, which is earthworm poop, right? This species deposits that at the surface. There were so many casts, I was able to scoop it up and send it to the soil testing lab. And then I also collected some of the regular soil. And look in this little chart right here is the differences in the plant nutrients. So in the worm cast, there was 130 pounds of plant available nitrogen compared to the rest of the soil, which had 25 units of nitrogen. Phosphorus was about the same, but look at potassium. In the worm cast, 226 pounds of potassium versus 49 pounds of plant available potassium in the soil. So from a perspective of plant nutrients, that worm fertility, that worm casts were really boosting the nutrient cycle there, okay? And the good news is it was free. That wasn't nutrients that we had to pay for. All we had to do is give those earthworms a good stable home and plenty of food to eat. And everybody's seen a fishing worm up close, right? So these night crawlers, they're segmented. And each one of those segments has 2 kidneys called nephridia. So just like our kidneys, earthworms' kidneys, the role of them is to filter the blood and take out that nitrogenous waste, right? So that's one of the ways that the earthworms contribute to nitrogen is in the slime or the goo that they exude. It's about 60% nitrogen. So each one of those segments with 2 kidneys, that earthworm that's 8 inches long, there could be 600 kidneys in that thing, pumping out that nitrogenous waste. So as a rule of thumb, in a good, healthy soil, if you dig a hole, about 1 square foot, we would like to find about 8 to 10 earthworms, which equates to about 1 million earthworms per acre. So just to kind of acknowledge the beauty of plant roots, I'm sure all of y'all have seen this picture before. It was based on some work that a professor in Nebraska named John Weaver did in the teens, 20s, and early 1930s. They would dig soil pits, and he would have his graduate students trace those plant roots to show how deep into the soil profile that they go. The thing I would call out on this picture is on the left-hand side, you can see that very shallow rooted plant. That would be the equivalent of a sod grass for your yard. Very low rooting right there. So think of these plants, if you were to take a soil sample for your garden or in a farmer's field, we collect the top 6 inches of soil. But our native plants, they don't need fertilizer, right? Because they can access untold amounts of plant nutrients deeper in the soil profile. This scale goes down to 10 foot, and some of these plant species are off the page, so below 10 foot. So this is a picture that I found. It was taken in the 1950s, late 1950s after the drought. It was actually hanging up in our field office in Corsicana. Some of y'all may have seen this picture before. This man, he worked at a research station, I believe down around San Antonio, and he was very impressed with the above ground portion of that grass. This would be where the soil line is, and look at the feet of roots that plant has. Okay, so we talk, or you hear a lot about, and we talk a lot about carbon sequestration, okay? Taking carbon out of the atmosphere and putting it into the soil. This is how we're going to do it with our native plants, okay? Those plants, roots going, that's at least 10 foot right there. That plant is putting carbon through those root exudates into that soil profile. I drew those red lines there because it's kind of going back to what I call my arch nemesis is the yard or the lawn grass. They like to keep that sucker clipped at about 2 to 3 inches above the soil line. And typically below ground mirrors the above ground, right? So Bermuda grass, there's no way it would ever put down a root 10 foot. So its roots are restricted probably top 6 inches, maybe a foot at the most, okay? So I kind of, just to get you to thinking, what is the carbon sequestration levels in the yard? And I would say not very much. And so carbon trend, in my mind, kind of equals the system trend. So we want things trending in the upward trajectory. That's not going to happen with the sod grass, okay? Compared to the carbon that we can store in the ground with our native plants. And so you won't talk with somebody that's a bigger proponent of native plants than myself. So kind of looking forward, I think everybody would agree our vision overall is a healthy planet, okay? And the values to get to that vision have to be our natural cycles, okay? We have to have water recycle. We have to have carbon cycling. We have to have that solar capture, okay? But I would say in North Texas, we have a very specific challenge that we need to overcome to attain that value or those values and reach that vision, okay? And it's urban sprawl. I was on Google Earth just trying to see if I could, in a sense, document how many people are moving to this area. So if any of y'all are familiar, here's Interstate 35 West coming up out of Fort Worth. And right where my cursor is Saginaw. Hopefully y'all can see that. And this is a screenshot from 1985. And I'm just going to I've got a couple slides here where I'm going to scroll over the years and just try to notice how many more neighborhoods start popping up. So here's 1985. Here's 2011. So some more neighborhoods popping up here. Here's 2020. So not only do we have neighborhoods starting to fill in these areas, we have some oil field activity here on the west side of the picture. Okay, so this was just 2 years ago. It's almost completely full of houses now. So just to kind of recap, I tried to draw with this red line, hopefully y'all can see it, kind of where the urban places were, or the neighborhoods in 1985. So I'm just going to keep scrolling. So the areas outside of the red line is how much growth that we've had. And so I would say we've had over 50% growth just in this part of the Metroplex alone. What's it going to look like by 2030? And I'm afraid it's going to look like this picture. This is a screenshot of Houston. Here's the 610 loop on the north side of Houston right there. It's solid people, okay? And I ask you, when we get in this situation, where's the water cycle, right? We know water needs to hit those residues, slowly infiltrate into the soil. What happens when it hits a roof or the driveway, you know, or even the compacted lawn? That water is going to instantly run off. Where's the nutrient cycle? There's no deep-rooted native plants there. Where's the carbon sequestration? Where's the soil health? And the short answer is it's not there. And, you know, I know people have got to have a place to live, but this earth needs balance. And I think your group, the native plant groups and master naturalists and groups like that, have to be the voice for Mother Nature to help educate people on why they're important.
Thank you, John. That was great.
I can try to answer some questions.
We do have, let's see, one question here already, and I think it may have already been answered, but Carol was asking about what kind of worms were on the worm cast fertility slide. I believe that was the night crawlers, wasn't it?
Yes. And you know, they do get some bad publicity, but like I said, they're filling a void, okay? The native worms, they're out there. The thing is, they don't grow as large, so a lot of them are just the diameter of a hair. So they're a lot harder to see, and a lot, you know, they're not as photogenic. Just to be frank, they're not as sexy, not as photogenic. So that's kind of why we kind of tend to talk about the earthworms more. I would kind of poll the group and ask them, do y'all get many questions from folks in the city that want to do native plantings, either in their yard or I don't know, any open areas like that?
Yeah, we do get plenty of questions about native landscaping in particular, and then we're also starting to get people who are interested in like land restoration or land stewardship.
Awesome. That's good news. I see another chat that says, have you heard of the blind worm?
Yeah.
Not specifically, but I didn't know worms could see anyway, so I thought they were all blind. Explain the importance of carbon in the roots. So roots are the kind of like our savings account for plants, though. And instead of saving money, that's where they keep their carbon reserves. Okay. And so you know, the beauty of plants is they make their own food. Like I said, that photosynthate, and they can store that to some extent in their roots. And that's why, you know, in the spring of the year, it's that little bit of reserve that kicks them off. Okay. Used to, they would think 100% of that carbohydrate or photosynthate reserve was used for the fresh shoots in the spring. But what they're finding out now is only about 10% of it's used for that regrowth. And the regrowth of those new leaves, you know, that's the solar panels that kicks off their future growth. So that's why it's important to leave a lot of leafy area on those plants. And as far as the carbon, I talk about carbon storage in the soil. Plants build organic matter in the soil three ways. The most obvious way is, right, the leaves and shoots on top of the ground decompose, and that adds to the organic matter. It composts in place. The other way is they actually inject carbon into the soil, like I said, to attract those microbes. So that builds up organic matter. And then the third way is they build organic matter through the microbes. So the more microbes there are, just think of them dying and repopulating. All of those bodies, actual physical bodies, contribute to the organic matter. So, we're storing solar energy in the soil, basically. So carbon is key to all of it. That's basically the gasoline that keeps that whole system running. So I would say as mismanagement occurs, we tend to lose carbon in our soil. So the organic matter percent actually declines. And so our soils over time become less productive. So to get them more productive, like if you want to grow a garden, what would you do? You would add things like compost or manures or something like that.
Here's another question about further out from here, like over in Quanah, is the soil there more barren, or are there any particular grains or crops that would help build up the soil?
Well, so barren is, I'm going to say in a sense, yes, but it's really as a response of the environment, right? So as you start to get that far west, you have really drier conditions, droughtier conditions. And so it's not uncommon to have, periods where your plants are dormant. Now, the kicker is if it's an overgrazed, like rangeland situation, the cattle are going to eat so much of that vegetation, the plant or grass, that's really what leads to the bare soil. Now, there's also some geologic pockets out there where the soil and the geology, for example, is very salty. Okay, so in those areas, in that situation, they're pretty much bare because there's too much salt for most plants to grow. So, in those situations, you're going to have a negative soil health anyway, but it's really as a response of the geology. As far as grains or crops, that's good wheat country. Some other ones, they do grow some oats out there. As far as non-traditional things, and I can't say for Quanah, but I can say for Vernon, and cover crop species that they've used is turnips, radishes, winter peas. Winter peas are very hardy, so they'll grow nearly on concrete. Cowpeas would be an example of a warm season broadleaf, but then also things like millets or sorghums would grow in the summertime as a cover crop. So there's some different options for sure.
Here's another question from Diana. Has soil management changed since the techniques taught following the Dust Bowl in the 1930s? And is the emphasis perhaps now more on carbon storage to combat global warming?
Yeah, for sure. So prior to the Dust Bowl, the primary tillage implement was what they called a mold board plow, MOLD board plow, and it would totally invert the soil. Okay, it was very a high degree of disturbance, and it made the soil very susceptible to erosion from water and wind. So starting in the late 30s, there was some of the management changes from a mold board. They would use a chisel plow or a disc. And a disc and a chisel plow leave the soil a little bit rougher, they call it, so it's a little less susceptible to erosion. But I'm not going to lie, erosion is still something that we fight today. I mean, if you drive to Lubbock, nearly every year you'll see some blowing dust, okay? And there's still water erosion around the Weatherford area, and and from, I'd say from kind of here east. um, so not only, like I said, all that disturbance in that management burned up the organic matter in those soils. So they were becoming less productive. Okay. So they started to realize, and I would say in the late 70s to early 80s, in some areas, is where they started to realize, hey, our management's killing our soils, right? And they didn't use the word carbon so much as organic matter. And organic matter is just carbon chains and a lot of other nutrients along with it. And so that's when they started to tinker, I'd say, with no-till. Well, no-till was not adopted in Texas, quite frankly, because the land grants, their research didn't show that it really worked here. Well, I went to a soils lecture. It was earlier in February, hosted by A&M, and 90% of the talks was about soil health and how management can improve the soils. Okay, so it's a win for farmers because it makes their soils more productive, and it's a win for the environment, and I would say mankind in general, because that management, no-till, for example, takes carbon out of the air and put it into the soil. I hope that makes sense. Now, I'm not going into all the details of what it takes to change management systems, but I'm going to say it's like kind of changing the rule book playing baseball to football, right? It's still a sport, but totally different rule book. So farmers and ranchers too have to change their mindset of how they approach management. Hope that makes sense. I had another question for the group is, does anybody do worm compost or vermiculture, they call it?
Diana says she does.
Sweet. So I think the species that they use for that is called red wigglers, excuse me. And it's my understanding if they have sufficient food, their population can double every 6 months. So very productive things.
Yeah, Diana says that's what it is, red wigglers.
Sweet. I've been tempted to do that myself, but I hadn't kind of.
Here's a question that I am wondering myself. Which plants indicate bad soil when you see them, like sandburrs, for instance, or are there any other things that are indicators of bad soil?
Well, I would say in general, the weeds. So anything you would call a weed, so it could be simple as a dandelion on up to a sandbur. Those are low successional plants that really thrive in a degraded soil. So any kind of weed that you would find in your yard is generally an indication of poor soil health, and it can be low in nutrients. It could be also a sign of compaction, right? So if your soil is compacted, you have less air, less water, less nutrients, right? Our native soil, our native plant communities on a healthy soil tend to have less diversity, right? So y'all seen rangeland maybe where it's really nearly % little blue stem. Okay, that soil is very stable. So that I was talking about that equilibrium in that rangeland with good little blue stem coverage, it's a very steady state. So that nutrient cycle is very slow, but very steady. I kind of equate it, I say plants are like peanut butter and jelly with the soil. Plants feed the soil. And if you were to compare it to human health, how can I say this? A person that's just a regular, not on any kind of special diet, we don't have to have a whole lot of diversity in our food, right? But if we're trying to be super healthy to address heart disease, high cholesterol, diabetes with high blood sugar, we have to start to maybe diversify our foods, change up what we eat. It's the same way with our soils. If our soils are poor health, those weeds kind of diversify the diet of that food, right? So that's the response. I mean, that's why we see dandelions, henbit, different things like that in our yards. I hope that answers the question, makes sense.
That's good.
Another question came in: can native plants be happy in disturbed soils after construction activities? Yes, for sure. You know, the beauty about our native plants is we have we've talked some about succession, and I wish I had more time to get into it. We have low successional native plants that really fit in those disturbed soils that help kind of build organic matter, for example, to make way for those higher successional native plants like Maximilian sunflower, big blue stem, Indian grass, different things like that. So yeah, our native plants, I can't express in words how great they are, right? And the beauty is they grow in a wide range of soil, everything from a pure sand to clay, you know, from a droughty soil to ones where it's actually too wet. You know, that's where we find things like sedges and things like that. So there's a native plant to fit every situation. I really enjoyed talking with you on the good questions. I wish it could be in person.
Presentation too. Thank you very much for coming.
Yeah, enjoyed it.